case you're new to A Gamer Looks at 40, you'll notice I try to stay on the positive side of things. But I also love differing opinions. It kind of makes things a little spicy on occasion. So when the founder of Premium Edition Games and co-host of the Nintendo Fuse podcast, Barry Carenza, reached out saying he had some hot takes about Final Fantasy VII, I had to have a conversation with him. What resulted was a 50-minute talk where Barry aired out all of his grievances. And while Barry's passionate about his opinion, as he should be, it's rooted in a true love for the Final Fantasy series, warts and all. And it's presented here in this episode completely unedited because I think he speaks for a large population of the Final Fantasy faithful. So let's join the conversation as we jump into episode 126, Final Fantasy VII, Part 8. It's Not All Sunshine and Sephiroth with Barry Carenza. So, Mr. Carenza,
yes,
I hear you have a spicy hot take about Final Fantasy VII, but before we jump into that, a big part of the first episode, at least, is going to be talking about the environment in which Final Fantasy VII was released, because it was like the first Final Fantasy game that was like an event that everybody knew about. So what was the buzz for you wherever you were? Where were you at that time? And what do you think, what was the buzz like for you leading up to Final Fantasy VII?
I was in high school at the time. I was more of a Nintendo kid. I did not have a PlayStation. I had N64. My friends had PlayStation.
Yeah.
And I remember there was really no internet. It was really infancy days. So most of the ads were magazine ads. And there was a commercial I remember distinctly. Final Fantasy VII and Ocarina of Time both had commercials that played very, very heavily at that time. And it was like the video game commercials were actually quite rare, especially outside of kids programs. Like kids programs, They had some, but only for the big titles. Those two breached into more adult stuff, and they were definitely targeted more towards adults. And I remember not many people even talking about it. I know RPGs were very niche at the time, and I was a huge fan of RPGs. The Super Nintendo and the NES both. We talked about Final Fantasy already on the Super Nintendo was a big one for me, and I loved 1, 2, and 3, which is really 1, 4, and 6 because I hadn't played the others yet, and I enjoyed Mystic Quest and Chrono Trigger and Mario RPG and Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior really at the time. I loved all those games, but I went N64 because I loved Nintendo stuff, and little did I realize it was going to be such an RPG drought. And I remember
barren wasteland.
It was. This was well before Quest 64 and Aiden Chronicles, which everyone forgets, and Hybrid Heaven and Paper Mario, which was probably the best RPG on the system.
Yeah.
But my friend who had a PlayStation, and I played all the PlayStation games over his house. We were like brothers. We were always hanging out. And I remember he got it. And he's like, "Hey, you got to come over and play this game." I said, "Okay." So I went over to his house and he started a new file for me. And not that I was going to keep playing it, but I got to the Midgar escape. I got a good chunk of time in an afternoon. And he was like, "Oh yeah, do this." I'm like, "This is pretty cool." And he's like, "This is amazing." I said, "It's pretty cool." And he's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "What do I mean?" I mean, it's nothing I haven't seen before. He's like, "But the FMVs are pretty." I'm like, "Yeah, but the gameplay is still the same." And he's like, but the materials, and I'm like, the Espers in 6 were better, or in 3 were better. I like the Esper system better. So then word started spreading a little bit more around our community. I was in high school, and some people, and the big thing was the whole Aerith. Can you say, or Ares? It was Ares at the time.
It was Ares at the time, right?
It was Ares at the time. Can you save Ares? And is there a way? And of course, this was the age before internet or early internet where, is Luigi in Mario 64 and run around and do all these things. And everyone believed it. And Photoshop was not a popular thing. So if there was picture proof, you believed it.
That was it. It was proof. Yeah.
It was proof. So people like, "Oh, well, here's Ares at the end of the game," and blah, blah, blah. And that was a big thing. And people were making such a big deal about it. And I looked at them and they said, "How are you not affected by this?" I said, "Bitch, I went to Yang's, wife and told her he died. He died. Like that was Final Fantasy 2, which was 4.
Yeah.
I'm like, that was emotional. I watched Kefka poison Doma's water supply and watched Cyan hold his wife and son or daughter, I forget whatever the child, like die.
Right.
I'm like,
right.
this is nothing. You're crying about this? This Final Fantasy has done way worse and had already in America.
Yeah.
Why are you making such a big deal about this?
You watched Cyan as his family goes on the Phantom train to the afterlife, and he says goodbye.
Yes.
To the somber tones. Yeah.
And it's
so
like, why are you making such a big deal? I watched Palam and Param like sacrifice themselves and turn to stone.
Yeah, two kids turned to stone. Yeah.
And it was just like, it was flabbergasted that, and to this day, people put that as like one of their biggest video game moments and the saddest video game moments. And I'm like, did you not play the others? And the usual response is, oh, I don't play anything before 7 because it's not 3D. And I'm like, that's the weirdest thing. That's like watching a car race and seeing a car go 100 miles an hour and go, wow, that's the fastest thing ever. And it's like, cars have been going 100 miles an hour for many, many years. Oh, no, but this was the first car. The first car I saw that did it, that's it. And I'm like, no. There's plenty of other cars that have done 100 miles an hour and way faster than that, well before this car. But it didn't matter. And it became this contention that people were like so obsessed over it, and it got frustrating because I'm like, this is not that big of a deal, and it's maybe your first experience with it, which I get it.
Right.
And acknowledging this was my first experience with it is one thing, but to put it as like hyping it to this level that it got insane. It was Game Pro and like, here's how to save areas and get a Game Shark and you could save her, blah blah blah, and all this stuff, and people are going crazy. And can you get the max final limit break with her before she dies and blah blah blah, and grinding all this. But go back and play the others. There's way sadder stuff in the first 6 Final Fantasy games. 7 was very tame in comparison.
No, that's a very I like that perspective because I've talked to a lot of people already who've had different experiences with Final Fantasy VII at different times. And you're right, those who played where that's their first RPG, which there's a ton of people where Final Fantasy VII was their first. The Aerith scene was destroying. I didn't play 7 until I was about 30 or so, like maybe like 14, 15 years ago. I played it on the PS3. It was like, I should just knock this game out. It was like PS1 classics or something. Yeah. Like, let me just knock it out. It's on sale. And my reaction was, this is fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. I like this. This is pretty cool. This is neat. I like the materia system. This is all fine. So I don't have that nostalgic thing, but you were there.
I was there.
And you were the one on the playground being like, hello, Celis jumps from a cliff in desperation because she thinks she might be the only person left alive on the planet, and we're concerned about the flower girl getting stabbed. And I'm not to demean that moment at all, but you're right. Final Fantasy has been doing this for a while, and it's very funny that was your reaction then and now. And
even the Celis scene, I didn't know at the time when I first played Final Fantasy VI as 3, was that if you fed Sid the faster fish, the healthier fish, he survived. I didn't know because I didn't have a guide, so I just grabbed whatever fish. So he died in my game. Yep. Sid died, and then Celis goes to commit suicide and sees Locke's bandana and all that, like holding it and like. That's rough. That blew me away. Like that was so emotional, and to this day still brings me to tears because there is that raw emotion there.
Yeah.
And 7 may have had prettier graphics in quotes because they really have not aged the best, but it's just funny to. It was like I was alone in the world. It was like, how are you not on this bandwagon? And I'm like, because to me, this is not that great. And of course, the Sephiroth bandwagon, because everyone was like, Sephiroth is the best villain in the world. I'm like, Kefka, did you not see what he did? Did you not? Like, Sephiroth didn't murder babies. Kefka did. What did
Kefka won? Kefka actually succeeded.
Sephiroth was just a guy with daddy issues and clone DNA and all that stuff, and he flipped and went psycho. Kefka was born psycho. It was just one of those things where It just
Yeah.
got overblown.
And 7 is an interesting. I think 7 is an interesting artifact. My end of the day take on 7. It's probably not in my top 5 Final Fantasies. Probably maybe 6. If I had to, like, maybe one day I'll rank them because I'm spending so much time in this world right now. Maybe I'll just do a ranking one of these days. But I like it fine. It's much better to me as a piece of fiction if you watch a video that tells the chronological story. And like I've been watching some videos and refreshing myself for the series. And if you watch it in that way, where it's like this chronological, it tells the story chronologically, it's actually really good fiction. It's actually a pretty cool story. But the largesse of Cloud and Sephiroth, I think, and the way Final Fantasy VII is told in the game, the original game, of course, masks all the other neat things that are going on. Like, I forgot Hojo is a thing. Like, I forgot. I had no idea. And he's like the main antagonist. Like, he's really the guy behind the guy. You know, I forgot about Rufus and all that. But because the largest of Cloud and Sephiroth overwhelmed everything. Yeah.
I remember before I fully played, like, I had only played it that much, and I knew my friend had played it. And because, again, I still didn't have a PlayStation yet. But when I finally got a PS2, before I got a PS1, and my main reason for getting the PS2 was Grand Theft Auto 3 and to play PlayStation 1 RPGs that I missed. So I got to spend an entire summer just, it was college. I was off for school. Nice. I wasn't working that summer, so I said, I'm just playing PS1 RPGs. Great. And on a lot of Squaresoft games, and one of the games I played was Energits, which was a fighting game. And I had played it once, like, in an arcade machine, but I was like, oh, cool, I'll play it and, unlock all the characters. Of course, it's known as the Final Fantasy fighting game because it's got Cloud and Sephiroth. And then it had an unlockable Zack. And I was like, who's Zack? So I asked my friend who played, and I said, so this unlockable Zack guy, he's a Cloud clone. Like, who is he? He's like, oh, I don't even remember Zack. I don't know who you're talking about. I said, okay. Wow. So then when I played Final Fantasy, I'm like, I'm going to play it myself. And I played through, and I'm like, got to that revelation, and I was like, this character that people have been boosting up, this Cloud is this great character, is just Zack. He doesn't even have his own personality. He stole it from Zack. And people who have played the game at the time, now people know who Zack is, but at the time who had played it didn't even remember it. Zack was just like a passing character. And I'm like, that is the personality that people really liked, was Zack hidden or disguised as Cloud. Cloud's personality was blank. Like, we didn't know who he was, and it just blew my mind. I'm like, this is the character you're champion? This character who doesn't know anything?
And again, what I find very interesting about the character of Cloud is that's actually an interesting idea. There's a bunch of fiction that I like that has the story of the trope of somebody did a bad thing, so they take somebody else's identity so they don't have to live with the bad thing they did. Like, that's an interesting trope to me, and there's a bunch of fiction that has that idea in it, and I like that idea. I think that's interesting. Cloud is actually a pretty sad character, as is Sephiroth. Yes. Sephiroth is a very sad character where when you realize what's going on, that most of the time it's really just Jenova pretending to be Sephiroth. But again, what I really find interesting about Final Fantasy VII is that it was this giant blockbuster. There was Cloud, Sephiroth, and that's all most people remember. Now, obviously, you talk to true fans, like real fans, they celebrate all the characters, and I've had those conversations. But I've also had conversations with people who just talk Cloud and Sephiroth because it's like, and it's interesting. It's just interesting.
Not only that, though. Because if you think about that time, it wasn't just like Energits. Energits was marketed as the Final Fantasy fighter, which of course Cloud, Sephiroth, and the reason Zack was there is because it was a clone character. It was easy, change the head, boom. Right. But then you had Final Fantasy Tactics where Cloud was unlockable, and it then what really for me was when they started doing the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Where they did Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy Advent and Children. And I was just like, really? Do we really need this much materia? And I mean, I'll be honest, Crisis Core was a better game in my opinion. I really like that story. And that was Zack's. That was Zack's story.
Yeah, this was Zack's story.
But what, like, even with all that, it was like, it was still like haunting me. It was like high school was haunting me at this point because I was now in college. But then a game came out while I was in college called Final Fantasy XI, which I can't wait to talk about. I love Final Fantasy XI. But if you played Final Fantasy 11 back in 2004 when that game came out, or 2003 if you played on PC, I was PS2, so I played 2004 when it came out. You saw something whenever you walked around Juneau or Bastock or Sandoria or Windy. You saw everybody and their mother was XX Cloud XX, XX Sephiroth XX, Cloud Strife, Sephiroth 111. Like
That's
everybody
good.
named Cloud and Sephiroth of some variety. And it was just like, oh my God, get originality here. You create your own character, be yourself. And it's like, no, I got to take the identity of Cloud or Seph. And it was,
That's funny.
and it's like, oh my, it's unbelievable how many. Like, did you guys not have any imagination? Like, is that
I
all you
guess
could think
not.
about?
That's so funny. I love that. That's really good.
It's a true thing, and I still see it in like 14, but nowhere near what I saw then, because then it was way more
Still new.
new.
Current, yeah.
And it just, and I think that was the biggest thing, is that it was just so, it wasn't that 7 was a bad game, because it wasn't. 7 was a good game, like you said. I put it mid-tier. I think it's a mid-tier game. I thought it had some unique characters, unique stories, unique ideas, and it wasn't that it was executed poorly, because it wasn't. It was a mid-game. It didn't do anything first, other than you say the materia system, but materia system was kind of like the Esper system in a sense.
Yeah, it's kind of combine Espers and jobs, kind of, sort of.
Correct.
Kind
yeah.
of, sort of. Yeah.
Kind of, sort of. But it what it was is it just blew up to the point that everyone thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And whenever something gets that big, you have to look at it critically. You can't just go like, oh, it must be because everyone else says it. At least I'm not the kind of person that falls into that. I'm like, no, I need to analyze, why is this the case?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it's the case is, for many people, it was their first RPG. And like you mentioned, the marketing campaign helped solidify that.
It's, yeah. Go on, sorry.
And not just of the time. I say, if you look at it objectively, not subjectively, and I'm not trying to say if this was your first RPG in your childhood and you love it, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if you look at it objectively in the world of RPGs, it wasn't even the best of the first 7 Final Fantasies, let alone counting other series like Dragon Quest or Warrior, Chrono Trigger, the Mana series, Grandia, all these other great series that had come out. It was mid-tier even then. It just introduced FMVs, which got a lot of people excited, even though we had just got through that whole terrible FMV era where everything had FMVs and Sega CD and 3DO and CDI, and it was a terrible era. If you were not there for the beginning of CD games, it was terrible.
Ooh, it was not. Lots of loading screens, lots of 5 frames per second videos of bad actors. It just, it was
just a bad, so
unpleasant era. Yeah.
And it got to a kind of a deterrent, especially as we go into the next game with FMVs, where God help you if you summon the GF and 8, because you might as well just go make a sandwich, because some of those are just ridiculously long.
We can chat about 8. I don't know if we'll have time, but I am going to do something on 8. I played it for 3 hours earlier this year, and I got 3 hours in, and I said, that's enough. That's enough.
I'm excited to talk about 8, but my point is they took what people loved, in quotes, and I say that in quotes because I don't think people necessarily loved it for that. I think it was just something new and shiny at the time, was these FMVs, and you couldn't do that on the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis or anything like that. So for a lot of people, they saw that like, oh, it's like a movie. This is cool. And they said, like, that's what people want. And for a while, Square was known for their FMVs. Like, that was their thing. Like, oh, it's got to be an FMV. And to the point that even when they re-released 4, 5, and 6 and 1 and 2 on the PlayStation 1, they actually added FMV openings and stuff like that, and FMV endings, and for certain scenes, which I appreciate. I think that's cool. But there's a big difference between banking your entire game on it and then, adding it as an opening and an ending. And if you look at the original 7, like the graphics, everything was static, pre-rendered backgrounds, and the characters were blocky. Like, the graphics were not good. and I think a lot of people remember it being better than it was, and maybe it's because they remember the FMV versions.
Right.
The other
Mhm.
thing that really got me about 7, and this was nothing to do with the game itself, it's just I when I played Final Fantasy, I started with 1, and Final Fantasy was always that. It was fantasy. And as it started getting on, 1, for at least at that point, 1, 4, and 6, it was fantasy, and 6 started getting some steampunk. But it wasn't it was built into the story about the War of the Magi and the magic disappearing. So now technology was starting to come and magic was coming back. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. But then you look at 7 and you got Cloud riding on a motorcycle, riding down the stairs, and you've got trucks and you've got this futuristic city. And I'm like, this is no longer fantasy.
Mhm.
This is like set in a futuristic world. Is this really Final Fantasy? And obviously that continues further into 8, and you can tell that Square realized that with their course correction in 9,
Right.
where they went all the way back and they're like, "We're sorry."
Reverse course. Yeah.
It was an
Reverse.
apology. We're sorry.
Yes.
And they obviously haven't done that again until 15, really, which was again 16 was kind of like a reverse. Let's go back.
Yeah.
13 could be argued, but it wasn't as bad.
It's a bit
And
of a combination.
it was also kind of another planet kind of deal too.
Yeah.
But you look at that, and I was looking at it, I'm like, this isn't Final Fantasy to me. I'm not riding up an elevator with a spider robot attacking me. Like that doesn't scream Final Fantasy to me.
Interesting.
What
It's interesting,
screams Final
yeah.
Fantasy is seeing Bahamut like as an actual dragon and fighting and just warrior and thief and black belt at the time, which was monk, and like red mage and white mage and black mage. That's Final Fantasy. Summoner and or caller, if you will, and blue mage and dancer, and not what we got. People with spiky hair with big giant swords, and yes, Tifa was a monk. That's cool.
Yeah.
Barrett had a freaking machine gun for his arm. That's not Final Fantasy. It is to a lot of people because that was their first game,
Right.
but it's not Final Fantasy growing up with Final Fantasy, and it was very jarring.
And it was Final Fantasy VII is, I think, more important than it's good. And that's not taking away from Final Fantasy VII. It's not, but I think it's more important because that's the game where everything changed, and forever. It forever changed, except for 9 kind of course corrected and went more to that fantasy style. But
so did 10, 11, like
10, 11. Yeah, they course corrected, and it's kind of, but 10 still dabbled in that mixed world. After Final Fantasy 9, when Final Fantasy 9, I'm actually playing it right now for the first time. I'm like a third of the way in, and I'm actually really enjoying 9. It's a lot of fun. I think it's a lot of fun, especially after the icky taste of 8, which I did not like. But yeah, I guess I'm trying to think it through. Final Fantasy X probably is just as much of a mix of technology and magic and fantasy as 6 does, probably.
Yeah.
Probably similar kind of combination.
I mean, outside of the airships, but airships were there from the very beginning.
Right.
It's a staple at this point. And Sid, it started in 2 and retroactively added in 1.
Yep.
But that was really it. But 7 and 8 and 15 really are very much outliers in that technology, where cars and vehicles and motorcycles and like they play center stage, and like that never says, and I guess fantasy could be anything, but when you think Final Fantasy, at least when I think Final Fantasy, I think more medieval, which is how it started. And same with Dragon Quest. Could you imagine Dragon Quest 12, suddenly they hop into a BMW and they're driving around? It would be like, what the hell is this?
What's going on? Yeah.
Dragon Quest stayed true to the fantasy nature. And some people may say that to a fault. I disagree. I think that was the whole point of the series, is that it is supposed to be more of a fantasy setting. And Final Fantasy always was too. And it's still a fantasy setting. It's just more of a futuristic. It's like Star Wars fantasy setting.
Right.
But that's not Final Fantasy. That's Star Wars. And if you remember Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, the Final Fantasy movie, which I enjoyed very much so, but the biggest complaint that people had with it is this doesn't feel like Final Fantasy. And if you watch it, it's very Star Wars-y, sci-fi, futuristic. And that same sentiment is what I had towards 7.
I think that's an interesting perspective. I think you give voice to a lot of people who feel the same way about Final Fantasy. And for early on in this series, which seems like years ago now, it really does feel like forever ago, I posited, the age-old question, what is a Final Fantasy? And the answer to that is it's different for everybody, right? And that's a true, and that sounds like a cop-out statement, but it's really true, because Final Fantasy could be a number of different things to a number of different people based on your experiences. It is time once again to say thank you to my wonderful patrons and a brand new member. Cue that DJ horn I'm not going to put in. It's not happening. I got a lot to do today. Welcome to Lucas Thompson. He signed up on the $3 fan tier. He's going to be getting these episodes on Friday as opposed to Monday, and I am very grateful for his financial support. He joins other stalwarts like Lindsay Harney, Philip Becker, Joey Coro of Perfect Storm Gaming, Terry Kinnair, Greg Seward of the Player One podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, Games with Coffee, the Let's Play Princess of Nerds of Broadcast, BT Goebbels, Tim Knowles, formerly of The Elitist, Julian of the Stage Select podcast, Seth Sergil of the All End Media Network, and finally the one and only fantastic Pete Harney. If you would like to be the second person this year who signed up for Patreon, then go to patreon.com/8gamerlooks at4040. Check out the tiers and sign up today. What's your take on the story of Final Fantasy VII? What's your feelings on that?
I mean, the story itself, I feel, is okay. I mean, I don't think it inherently does anything wrong at all. And there's a lot of fun to be had. There's a lot of fun characters to be had. Again, I think what you're talking about is nostalgia. To me, the biggest problem with 7 is those that feel it's their favorite and it was their first game and all that, they feel it could do no wrong. It was infallible. Everything was perfect. And you're thinking on, as a kid, maybe it was your first, and it blew your mind. Never seen this before, which is a shame. You should have had a Super Nintendo or a Nintendo to play those other stuff. But still, you hadn't seen it before. But if you go back objectively and look at it, you see there's those issues. And like you mentioned, it does have its issues. And the worst part for me, like, again, the story you said is mid. I didn't think it blew me away. When I did play through it, I thought it had some really interesting concepts with the live stream and all that stuff. I thought that was really, really cool. I liked where they were going with it, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. I feel those outspoken that have really pushed Square into thinking that this was the greatest thing in the world is what also hurt it. I don't know if you remember this, but when the PlayStation 3 was first shown off, or early showing off, there was a tech demo for Final Fantasy VII's Open. I don't know if you remember this. They showed it off at E3. Okay. It was the opening of Final Fantasy VII on the PS3. People went crazy, and Square said it was just a tech demo. And then people started sending death threats to Square because it was just a tech demo. Ooh. And seeing things like that showed me that people became obsessed, and now, like, this was after the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, like, this was bad. Like, this was to the point that they're so obsessed with 7, it actually hurts 7 in my eyes, even though it's not the game's fault. It's not the people's fault. And obviously that convinced Square to say, let's remake it, which of course they remade it. And they literally said, buy a PS4 for Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it's only the first of 3 parts. Mm-hmm. Oh, if you want to play part 2 and even the 1.5, because there's the intermission, you now have to buy a PS5. Sorry you bought a PS4 for it. You only get part 1. And I guarantee you PS6 is going to be part 3. And the second part has underperformed. And they're like, why is it underperforming? It's Final Fantasy VII. And the truth is 1, it's the middle part of the story. 2, does it really need to be 3 parts? And 3, maybe you're listening to the outspoken people that are oh my God, 7 is the greatest ever, and not the true fans, not the fans that are like, we love everything of the series and we want new games and would rather to see Final Fantasy 17 and 18 out of that instead of more Final Fantasy 7. And, and it just got to that point where people held it on this pedestal. Like, this is the greatest story ever told. Like, everyone, like, I have to read this to my children because everyone, and it's like, no, it's an okay story. It's an okay game. Like, it's a good game, but you're holding it to such a pedestal that you're detracting from it. And whenever you hold anything to those high standards and you try and present that to somebody, you present it in a way that's infallible. You present it in a sense that nothing could ever touch this, nothing could ever beat this. And to anybody that falls into it, if it doesn't meet these high standards you now set to the game, they're going to find it as a disappointment. Wait a minute. You said this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I'm halfway through it, and I'm like, there's nothing special here. Why did you do that to me? Versus just say, here's a game, go in with zero expectations and enjoy. And I feel it's one of those games that is impossible to go into with zero expectations at this point because of how blown up it is. And it's to the point that this is probably dating myself, but when The Sixth Sense came out, it was a big thing if you revealed the secret of it, which now most people know, of course, but it was like, oh, don't do it. And I felt like it was the same thing with 7, like, oh, Ares dies. Oh, no, you ruined 7 for me. And it was like, if that's your big takeaway from the game, something happens midway through the game, and it's ridiculous. I don't know if you're going to cover the remake or not, or if it's going to be part of this whole
further down
thing.
Because I haven't played them yet, so I will eventually down the line. But yeah,
okay, because I was going to say one thing I was really worried about with the remake, because I did play it. Keep in mind, after I said all this, I did play 7 remake, I played Intermission, and I played Rebirth. I was really worried that they were going to do something where they were going to be like, oh, Ares is going to be saved, like, or Aerith now is going to be saved. Like, they're going to give fans what they want. And they actually didn't. They didn't. They stuck with it. And I was like, yeah, I'll give you props there. They're doing a lot of other things, which I'm really, I was excited for what they were doing. And I was just like, at the end of Remake, they set it up. And it's like, oh, what are you doing with this? You're now making a new story. And then Rebirth is kind of like, we are, but we're kind of not. And everything I was hoping to see happens. And I don't know if you know what happens or anything, or if you know.
I've tried to stay away from the Rebirth a little bit because I do want to play them eventually for this series.
Have you ever seen the cover of Rebirth, like the actual physical cover?
Yes.
Okay, so then there's 3 characters on the cover.
Right. Yes.
And one of those characters shouldn't be there.
That's a good one.
And I was excited because what happens at the end of Remake was like, oh, they're going to do something and they're going to bring Zack back, and now he's going to be in the party, and they're going to have like they love the love triangle. Like Final Fantasy VII is also known for the stupid love triangle. Yeah. Which I'm sorry, Aerith goes with Zack, and Tifa goes with Cloud. I'll say it there. Right. But they're going to do something here, and they're going to bring Zack into it, and that's going to change that dynamic. And I was all excited for it. And they didn't do that. They didn't do that at all. He's in the game minimally. You play as him minimally. They set these expectations up to do something new, and they just like, oh, we're gonna play it safe, and we're gonna use. And I know it's tired now. I'm a big fan of multiverse. I love it, but we're gonna use the multiverse to say, look, Zack's in another world, and I'm like, come on, if you're gonna do something crazy, bring them together. But no, it's the same game, but with more padding. And a terrible jungle level with beautiful jungle music, but a terribly designed jungle level, and terrible pacing if you're 100%er, which I am. So if
I am not 100%er, so for me, I can depends on the game. Some games, for some reason, I just get into. For example, maybe last month or 2 months ago, finally 100%ed Vampire Survivors, and I love that game. And sometimes the game gets its hooks in me, but that's a rarity. Like that's a rare. That's a rare.
If it's one of those things, like if you ever played platforming games, like you played Mario 64, do you get all the stars before moving on to the next level, kind of deal? Like try and do
that. No. Okay. If it's a, let me think it through. No, I don't have to. I've kind of gotten to the point in my life where I'm like, I can miss that star. If the journey is not fun, then I'm like, I can miss it. I don't.
So Rebirth shows like the open world thing where they take like the Ubisoft technique with all the towers and
Yeah, yeah.
Breath of the Wild style
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah.
And each of the worlds is 6 big like levels that have a crap ton of the stuff, and it's all the same objectives. Every single one is the same objectives
see, that's
outside
not.
of like the main story. And it was like nice. It was like a small level, open world, small like per chapter. I'm like, this is good. Like, let's space it up. And then you get to like 3 chapters in a row that's like half of an open world, and I do 100% before moving on. And I was like, I'm spending 20 hours in these 3 chapters because I'm 3 open worlds in a row or open level. I'm like, this pacing is terrible. I need something to break it up.
Yeah.
But that's the bloat, and they're doing that because of the original Final Fantasy VII. They're doing that because Square, the development costs are ballooning right now.
Right.
The Tomb Raider has underperformed. That's why they sold the IP. All these games are underperforming, so they said, let's go back to what people apparently want, Final Fantasy VII. Right. And they did it in a way to absolutely milk. If any other company were to say, we're going to take a game and sell it in 3 parts completely, like, people would be irate.
Yeah. You have to get the entire story, you have to pay a minimum of $170 for this one game, for this giant monolithic game. Is $55, whatever. Right?
And they've done it before, like Xenosaga, which someone listening might be like, oh, Xenosaga was supposed to be 6 games and they had to cut it down to 3 because, and you know what, you're right. But Xenosaga was set out to be 3 or 6 originally complete games telling one larger story. Right. They weren't taking Xenogears and saying, we're going to remake Xenogears and we're going to cut it into thirds. Yeah. They didn't do that. They were telling an original story set out to be that way, which is fine. If that's how you're going to set up the game, telling sequels, that's great. But when you're remaking a game and you're saying, oh, you're getting it in 3 parts, that changes the dynamic. Now, the people who love Final Fantasy VII and think it's the best thing since sliced bread won't care. They'll gobble it up. They're the people who bought it on PS4, PS5, physical, digital, PC, bought a PS5 just for it. Yep. If they said 6 is PS5 Pro exclusive, they would buy a PS5 Pro just for it. That's the minority. The majority of people will be like, I'll get it on sale, or I'll check it out what it is and how good it is. And, it's Final Fantasy Uncharted, honestly, is what that is. It's not bad. I enjoyed it. But again, I think it's a better game overall than the original, but not by much. But at least the original is complete.
Yeah, and a whole complete thing, yeah.
It's a whole complete game. Yes, there's more to tell. Obviously, there's Crisis Core, which is the before story. That's like a prequel. Fine, I love Crisis Core. Dirge of Cerberus, was that needed? Was Advent Children really needed? Was Before Crisis really needed? I forgot, there's also the new Final Fantasy VII. There's a mobile game at the same time as Rebirth. That's also on Steam. I forget its name. Was that needed? Like, no. The reason they're doing this is because they are milking it, and you see it. You see the effects of 7 in other games too, like Chocobo GP. I don't know if you've played that. That's on the Switch.
No.
I really like it. It's a good kart racer, but they tried to do a season pass thing. It failed. Since then, they've decided to just make all the characters unlockable. But in order to get you to buy the season pass allowed you to earn points to spend on the first season pass character, because usually season passes of these type of online games have an exclusive character. That exclusive character just happens to be Cloud. The second one was Squall. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, right.
They knew what they were doing. They were doing that, but Terra was base game. Like, no problem. Right. And it's like they did that on purpose because they're like, how do we get people to buy this? Cloud. People will buy a pile of if we put Cloud's picture on it and say Cloud took this turd himself. People will buy that. And you see it. And it's not even an exaggeration at this point, because you see it in all these other Final Fantasy and other spin-off games. You see it in Super Smash Brothers. Why was Cloud thrown in there? Cloud didn't appear on Nintendo until the Switch, but
Right.
Cloud was on the Wii U. Why?
Right.
Why wasn't Terra? Why wasn't Locke? Why wasn't Cecil? Why wasn't Warrior of Light? Who would make sense? They put Cloud because they knew it would sell. And if you notice, they only gave 2 songs because the 3DS version of Smash 4, you got 2 songs, so the Wii U only got 2 songs.
Right.
And then you look at Smash Ultimate when they added the DLC characters, and Square finally gets multiple representations. They get Hero, which is great, something for Dragon Quest. But then, hey, let's get a character for Final Fantasy again, another one. And who did they get? Sephiroth. So you have 2 Final Fantasy characters representing Final Fantasy out of 16 games. You put 2 from the same game.
Right.
Like, to me, that just says they should have done another character. They should have done it on another, Final Fantasy 6, Final Fantasy 5, 4. Even if they said, let's do Clive from Final Fantasy 16 because that's a new thing coming out.
Let's do Titus or Auron. Like Titus would fit into the Smash. Auron would be awesome in Smash. Like, that'd be a really cool
Dane
character.
Or a Moogle or
a Moogle. Pick a Moogle.
Moogle on a Chocobo.
Would be great. A Moogle on yeah. That's a very good point.
But they didn't, because it's 7. It's like they were so brainwashed. And when you see things like that, it, to me, as somebody who never fell into the hype and saw it objectively and was just like, the more I see this overblown, the more I'm starting to resent this game, even though it's a good game. Mm-hmm. And then you see things like this. I can't look away. Everywhere it's 777.
Final Fantasy VII is to Final Fantasy series as Ocarina of Time is to Zelda. That's kind of how I see it.
I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, it's a game that's fine. It's fine, but the largesse of it has made it this bigger than life thing. That's it's almost unassailable.
What happens whenever there's a new Zelda game? They compare it immediately to Ocarina of Time. What happens when there's a new Final Fantasy? They compare it to Final Fantasy VII. So 100%. And at the time, again, I had it in 64. I got Ocarina of Time at launch. I'm a huge, huge, huge Zelda fan. Yep. Just beat Echoes of Wisdom. Loved it.
Cool.
And I loved Ocarina of Time. And I watched people put it at the top of the games list. And I'm like, Link's Awakening was my favorite. And that was a Game Boy. And that was already out at the time. So it didn't even hit my top Zelda list when it was new, let alone then. And so I saw it too. And I have the same resentment towards Ocarina of Time for that. I've lessened that on Ocarina of Time than I have for 7, simply because I feel we're so far divorced from Ocarina of Time that people have started to look towards other things. I'm seeing Wind Waker put in there, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, of course, Tears of the Kingdom. Seeing these other games start to top that list and move Ocarina of Time down, which I'm happy to see. And now people can go into Ocarina of Time enjoying it as the first 3D Zelda game and not this infallible, perfect piece of art, because it wasn't. 7, however, is constantly still in the mainstream. I was, no joke, I was watching this video last night on YouTube. It was someone doing their top 20 songs on the keyboard from video games, which was great. And they did a bunch of games. Zelda was there, Mario and stuff like that. But they did the Prelude, Final Fantasy's Prelude, which is great. But they labeled it Final Fantasy VII Prelude. I'm like, but the Prelude is not. Like, the Prelude is original. Like, that's not the first place it appeared. It's like the theme of Final Fantasy. It's not just 7. That's like granted, fanfare is different per game, but it's still that da 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 da. That is original. That's not from 7.
You're right. That's very funny that they would do that. How interesting.
And it was like, and they didn't do that with other series. Like when they did like Great Fairy Fountain, they just said Zelda. They didn't say which Zelda. It was just Zelda. But that one specifically, they were like Final Fantasy VII, which tells me that's probably the only one they played, and they think it only came from 7.
Yep. Most likely.
And it's like, I still see that to this day, and that's just fan things. And I'm not taking away from that video. The video was great. The person was very, very talented. Right. But it's like you see those things, and it's just like grading. Another instance of 7 being used to manipulate the audience, and I truly mean this, is Final Fantasy Advent Children, which we talked a little bit about. Do you remember how Final Fantasy Advent Children launched?
I do not. I don't remember how it launched.
So it didn't launch on DVD or VHS or Blu-ray or anything like that.
Yeah.
The first place it launched was on PSP UMD, the UMD movies. They
Ooh.
used it to sell the PSP, and then afterwards they
Wow.
went
Okay.
to home movie,
Yeah.
Blu-rays and DVDs and all that.
Really? Did
Yeah,
that have a theatrical release? I think it
it might have. It
it
might have had a
did,
theatrical as well,
but
but
it
the
came out
first
on UMD.
home was
Oh my gosh.
UMD video, and I believe I might be wrong, but I believe it was a pack-in. It might have been a pack-in.
Okay.
I do know that the Dissidia Final Fantasy, or the PSP, when Dissidia first came out, or it might have been Duodecim. It was like a silver PSP. I think it was Dissidia. One. It came with Final Fantasy VII Advent Children along with it, but it was used as I think you're looking it up now.
I am now.
I,
Yeah. I am.
if I'm not mistaken, it was used as a marketing tool to get people to buy the PSP because it was
That's
Sony's
wild, man.
first foray into portable and a Nintendo dominated thing. How do we get people to come to our system? Let's use Final Fantasy VII. And it was a
That
movie.
is so funny. That's very, very interesting. It's funny. I'd rather talk to you than look it up. That's amazing. That's a Final Fantasy VII, and that's what that's one of the big reasons why I was so interested in doing this series and in doing Final Fantasy VII. It's not for the game because again, I like the game and it's a game I played and enjoyed and I thought was fine. I was like, okay, this is neat. This is cool. I didn't have that overwhelming love for it. But Final Fantasy VII, again, it's just that it's the closest the series has to like the flagship. Like that's like the flagship game of Final Fantasy. If you ask most people, video game people, about the game Final Fantasy, they'll probably talk about 7. And also, and just because historically the most people probably played it because you had new people to the series in Final Fantasy VII, plus old heads like you and I who played it. And they didn't play 1 or 2, right? So I find it interesting it's like I think I said this in another interview. It's like an action movie directed by an indie director. It's like a blockbuster done by someone who is only known for like indie dramas. All of a sudden Marvel gives them a bunch of money and they make, Shang-Chi or something. It feels like a blockbuster that has all these cool ideas in it. But at the end of the day, it's still a big blockbuster. More than I think even games that came after it, like 8 and 9. 8 tried to be the big blockbuster. 10, I think, is the closest that came to it. But even then, it never felt as ubiquitous as 7. 7 is this all-encompassing thing.
Yeah. It's and I think, like I said, that's the biggest issue is it's taken on a new role. And like you said, you ask somebody, they're probably going to go 7. Like, what's your favorite Final Fantasy character? And they're going to say Cloud. And there'll be, or Sephiroth, or another character from 7. And you say, well, have you played any others? And most likely it's going to be no. Or, well, I tried 8, or I tried 10. And like, that's it. So your favorite character of a series of 16 plus games, because there's a lot of sequels and spinoffs, is you have 3 games in there. So your sample size is incredibly low. And like I said, the majority of people that I talked with at the time, like I'm talking, 1997 to probably 2005-ish.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
During that time period, every time I said that they loved 7, I said, well, did you play 1 to 6? And they said, no, I can't do sprites. It's too ugly. I can't go back and look at it. I'm like, it's too ugly. What are you talking about?
That's wild. That's very of its time. That is a sentiment of the time. That's totally and there are some sentiments of that now. Obviously, I think times are changing a bit when it comes to pixel art and things like that. But you're 1,000% right. Nobody was playing pixel art Final Fantasy games in 1999. Like no one was doing it. That was not very few people were. Maybe old people like me. Again, I was in 99. I was 19, 20. So old heads like me were probably still playing it. Relatively old heads. But nobody contemporary. That's a different thing down the line. Do you think that's changed at all? Like, what do you think? Do you think that's changed?
I think so. And I'm seeing it like with the Pixel remaster.
Right.
So I'm seeing a lot of people go through like on Twitter and stuff saying like, oh, I'm playing through 1 to 6 for the first time because I never did before and I figure I'll do it. And I'm seeing them like do the reviews and obviously 1 to 3 rougher. but they're early. You got to give them, and then they get to 4, 5, and 6, and they're like, oh my god, I'm blown away by these games. Like, what
Yeah.
the heck? These
What was
games
I
are
missing?
exceeded my expectations, and I'm like, they were always that good.
Yeah.
You just didn't play them for choice because it wasn't for lack of release. Because if you think about it, 4 and 6 had Super Nintendo, 4, 5, and 6 had PlayStation, 4, 5, and 6 had Game Boy Advance, 4 had PSP as well.
Yep. Yep.
You had the digital versions and the virtual consoles. You had the mobile versions, of course. There was a bunch of different ways to get. Four had a remake on the DS as well. You had a bunch of different ways to get 4, 5, and 6, and you didn't. For whatever reason, you didn't.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just a lack of desire because you were scared, or you just didn't think you were going to enjoy it, and now that you're more mature, you want to look back, and that acknowledgement is great. Now the question is, does it top 7? It's impossible for those people for the most part, because 7 is cemented in their head as the infallible pedestal that can never be topped. So no matter what you see, it's really hard. And this doesn't go with 7. This is just anything. When you have anything on that pedestal, it's really hard to be objective and look at it. When you have a favorite movie and a sequel comes out, it's really hard to be like, well, does it top it? I still prefer the original better. And if there's 3 or 4 or a remake, how many times do you hear that? I'd still prefer the original over the remake.
Right.
Even if it's nostalgia, it's that comfort, it's that bringing you back to your childhood. And for many people, 7 was their childhood, and I'm not going to take that away. I don't want to take that away. I'm glad you had that wonderful experience. I just want people, and I wanted it then, for them to open their eyes and look at the greater picture that Final Fantasy is more than Final Fantasy VII, more than Cloud, more than Sephiroth. That it's a great game and it's great to enjoy it, but look and try and experience other things and try and keep an open mind, because you'll find some great stories, great characters, and wonderful things to love. It's the same type. You see people who go, I played every Final Fantasy sans 11 and 14. Right. And I'm like, why? Well, they're online. I don't do online games. I'm like, well, you're missing 2 of the best Final Fantasy stories because of that. Like, look past your comfort zone.
Guilty. I've been guilty of that. Like, I never played 11 because it was an online game. I didn't have a PlayStation, and I played 14 at the behest of a friend who literally said to me, "Oh, are you gonna play Final Fantasy 14?" I'm like, "No, it's a MMO. I don't play MMOs. I don't play online games." And she said, "You like Final Fantasy, right?" And I go, "Yeah, I like Final Fantasy. I love Final Fantasy." She's like, "Play 14. Play Realm Reborn." She's like, "Play Realm Reborn. It's a great story. I think you'll love it." And sure enough, she's right. And I played Realm Reborn, and I was very into Final Fantasy 14 for 6 months, and I thought it was great. So I really think it all comes down to what you're exposed to first, and your willingness or your appetite to have more, and I think these days, I'd like to think people want more, and I think people are more open to expanding their horizons. It's a lot of game to go through. But I agree with you. I think I'm glad the Pixel remasters exist. I have my issues with them, but I think as just having those games available, easy to play, pop in and play on your Switch or Steam, I love it. I love the fact that you can easily get them and have them.
I mean, the Pixel remasters, my biggest issue is they don't include like the advance or the GBA bonus content and stuff. Like, if you're going to remake a game, make it the complete game.
Yeah, everything. I agree with that. Yeah, all the complete dungeons, all the extra stuff in one. And that's a very good point.
Final Fantasy IV Intermission is still locked to the PSP UMD. There's no other release of that.
That's
and
right.
It's like, come on.
I still have to play Tactics. I've never played Tactics. That's just never, again,
that's
never
a different beast. That's a strategy role-playing game. But how did they sell that? It has Cloud in it.
Oh, didn't it?
How do we sell this? And you have to remember, strategy role-playing games at the time weren't the big things they were. We didn't have Fire Emblem in the States at the time. Right. Ogre Battle, or not, Tactics Ogre, did not do very well. It was a new thing. So how do we sell this Final Fantasy version over to it has Cloud in it? Oh, boom. and it came after. If you notice, Tactics released before 8, so Tactics was the next release after 7. So all those, they were banking on all those people who had played 7 and loved 7. They're gonna buy this because it's got the Final Fantasy name and Clouds in it, even though it's a completely different series, a different world, and a different type of game. And it sold Tactics, and it worked. And they realized at that point they can utilize Final Fantasy VII to manipulate the audiences to buy whatever they want. And that's the reason people bought a PS4, and that's the reason people bought, a PS5 now.
We'll continue to do so. Yep.
And they'll continue. And that's the main reason. It's every other thing. If they put Final Fantasy on any platform, if they said, hey, guess what, we're resurrecting the Ouya, and we're going to put Final Fantasy VII Part 3 exclusive to the Ouya, guarantee you people will be buying the Ouya like crazy.
That just about does it for this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. If you enjoyed this, and I can't imagine you not, then mosey on over to agamerlooksat40.com 40 that has all of the Final Fantasy episodes in the full series playlist section. Just make sure you refresh the page when you get in there. There's a weird bug on the website that prevents the players from loading right away. But you hit it again, and it works just fine. That way you can binge all of the Final Fantasy series, in addition to the Legend of Zelda series, the Earthbound series, and Tales from the Bargain Bin. And as always, comments and ratings on your pod player of choice are greatly appreciated. Next week is another one-on-one interview that is essentially the counterpoint to today's episode. So if you weren't a big fan of the negativity, even though I felt it was pretty well balanced, check out next week. We talk with somebody who ranks Final Fantasy VII as not only one of his favorite games, but one of the video games that got him into the medium in the first place. As always, many thanks to Pete Harney and Kev from the Discord for helping me edit up these interviews. Many thanks again to my patrons, and thank you for listening to this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. And until next time, just be kind to yourselves and each other.